Okay, this is a presentation on neuropsychology and moral decision-making by myself, Benjamin Locklear, and Peter Hitchcock.
That's me.
One of the first conceptions of moral decision-making comes from Plato, who in Phaedrus put forth the view of reason as the driver of a chariot which was hooked up to two horses. One of the horses, the white horse, was a noble horse of a noble breed, and it represented all of man's best emotions. And its goal was to drive the chariot towards good, desirable things. The other horse, the black horse, was an ignoble creature of an ignoble breed that didn't listen and represented man's baser instincts, the instincts towards destruction and acting badly. And according to Plato, the interplay between these two horses is what gave man such difficulty in deciding how to act. It was a model in which reason is in the driver's seat and is trying to mediate the conflict between these good emotions and these bad emotions. While our modern conception of decision-making, our modern folk understanding of decision-making, is not exactly the same as this Platonic idea, it has a lot of the same elements. For example, reason and emotion are considered to be two separate things. And in addition, reason, or the rational capability of the mind, struggles to control the emotional capabilities of the mind, and is ultimately in the driver's seat of everything that's happening. This is sometimes called the elephant and rider, where the rider is the rational mind and the elephant is the emotions. And while the emotions are strong and powerful and could easily dominate, it's the rider's job to guide the elephant in the direction that it wants it to go.
Much of the research following the cognitive revolution of the 1960s utilized this framework. However, in the 1990s, a series of researchers working in distinct disciplines began to write about the existence of moral emotions. Antonio Damasio, working with patients with lesions in the prefrontal cortices, suggested that our ability to feel negative bodily responses when we are considering a moral decision is what allows us to act morally. Or in other words, that the Plato's white horse may check in with the black horse to figure out how to act morally. Joseph Ledoux and other researchers began to show the complexity of the connections between emotion centers in the brain and parts of the brain that were historically considered cognitive. At the same time, researchers in other areas began to publish results that undermine the picture of rational decision centers in the brain. Michael Gazzaniga found that patients with disconnected cerebral hemispheres explained behavior they were unconsciously primed to enact with irrational or untrue interpretations. For example, an experimenter would flash "walk" into the right hemisphere, and the patient would get up and walk without being aware that he had been primed. When asked why he had gotten up, he would explain that he was thirsty and going to get a Coca-Cola. Meanwhile, Daniel Kahneman and others began to publish research on the cognitive biases embedded in so-called rational thinking.
Here's a clip of the kind of rationalization that Gazzaniga found.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why...
Yeah, why'd you pick that one? Music.
And when asked to explain...
It was music, Bell, and those few minutes ago, last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here. Banging away.
So the bell's outside here.
So, but couldn't answer me.
What's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain.
So it seemed as though decision-making, and by extension moral decision-making, was more than purely rational or purely emotional, but somehow a blend of the two. How then did moral reasoning work? There were two competing schools of thought. The first, consequentialism, was more of a rational approach. Under consequentialism, bad actions are bad because they cause bad things to happen. What this means is that nothing is inherently bad to do, it's only bad if it actually hurts other people. If you can do bad things to justify a good end, and that's still morally acceptable. The other school of thought is deontology, where bad actions are inherently bad. They are bad because they are breaches of the duties that we have as human beings to others. So even if doing something bad would create a good outcome, doing that bad thing under a deontological view would still be bad.
So what are you, a consequentialist or a deontologist? The trolley problem, a moral dilemma created by Joshua Green, will flesh this distinction out. Imagine that you're watching a train hurtling toward 5 people who are all tied to a railroad track and therefore will be killed if you let the train continue. One other person is tied to a parallel track. You're standing next to a lever which can divert the train from the track with 5 people, killing 1 individual but saving 5. Do you pull the lever? Most people think consequentially when asked this question and respond that they would pull the lever.
But what if we were to change the problem just slightly? Now, in the second variation of the trolley problem, we have the same out-of-control train, the same 5 people tied to the tracks, but instead of being able to throw a switch and divert the train onto a separate track with only 1 person on it, in order to save the 5 people, the actor must instead push a fat person from a footbridge nearby onto the tracks, thereby stopping the trolley but also killing the fat person in the process. Would you act differently in this scenario? Keep in mind that the outcome is the same in both cases. 1 person dies as opposed to 5. The discrepancy that occurs between responses to these 2 problems creates an interesting consideration. On the one hand, in the first problem, about 90% of respondents would throw the switch, even though throwing the switch causes the death of 1 person. It is outbalanced by saving the lives of the other 5. However, in the second problem, even though the outcomes are exactly the same, the actions of the person take 1 life at the expense of saving 5, only 10% said that they would choose to push the man from the footbridge. In the first case, people seem to be making their decisions in accordance with a consequentialist view of morality, and in the second case, the decisions seem to be made from a more deontological point of view.
fMRI activation patterns, while people are making their decision in response to the trolley problem, suggest that both areas typically associated with emotion and areas typically associated with cognition are active when people consider the trolley problem. However, when the problem is framed to suggest a personal role in the death of the 1 individual, as in the fat man scenario, the emotional centers are more active. By contrast, areas typically implicated in cognition are more active when the problem is framed impersonally, as in the lever version. These distinctions in brain circuits map on nicely to the consequentialist versus deontological distinction. A further finding is that individuals with lesions in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is the same area where Damasio reported that lesions interrupt our ability to feel our bodily reactions to emotion, show more consequentialist thinking in response to moral problems. Many of these people would have no problem pushing the fat man off the footbridge. Their body simply doesn't react in disgust to that idea. Taken together, these findings suggest that rather than decision-making being made monolithically by emotion or reason, these 2 compete with each other for our final moral decision. Most of us don't have a strong emotional bodily reaction when anticipating pulling a lever that would kill 1 individual. However, when we consider what it would actually be like to push a human being off the footbridge, our bodily reaction is intense enough that we wouldn't do it, even if 5 people die as a result.
So are we moral consequentialists or are we moral deontologists? The answer seems to be both, depending on how the problem is framed. Problems like the trolley problem pit the cognitive and the emotional centers of our brain against each other, creating a dilemma that needs to be resolved. When the role of the actor in creating the harm is more direct and less personal, for example, throwing a switch, the actor is more likely to act in a consequentialist manner. when the role in causing harm is more direct, for example, when you have to actively put somebody in harm's way by pushing them off a footbridge and onto the trolley tracks, you are more likely to act in a deontological manner. The moral reasoning that happens in our minds balances these two perspectives against each other, moderated by input from specific brain regions. And we know this because by damaging or affecting those brain regions, we can shift the balance of these considerations. So Plato's two-horse chariot makes a comeback here, but instead of having the good white horse and the bad black horse, instead we're mediating the conflict between the consequentialist horse and the deontologist horse. The interplay between these two considerations are what drives our moral reasoning. Now it's your turn. For this week's reaction paper, you may write on one of two prompts. The first would be to write about what your subjective experience of considering the two variations on the trolley problem was. What thoughts or feelings did these problems bring up for you? Did the manipulation work for you? That is, were your answers to the first and second problems different? Why do you think that your answers were the way that they were? Do you think this is a useful way to examine moral reasoning in humans? The second option would be to consider what the implications of these neuroanatomical findings are for the construct of criminal responsibility. Can we as a society really hold people responsible for their moral choices if, for example, they have brain damage to the areas of the brain that we discussed today? Consider what the implications of your answer would be for the criminal justice system in our country. For either of these choices, you may wish to inform your response with readings from the supplemental reading list, which will also be posted along with this video. Thank you, and good luck.